From New York, this is Democracy Now!
So effectively what they're trying to do is ban asylum. It's a very dangerous path for the United States to go on.
In a major victory for the Trump administration, the Supreme Court's ruled the U.S. government can fast-track deportations of asylum seekers without them first appearing before a judge. We'll speak to the ACLU attorney who argued the case before this court. Then we look at the growing controversy over police use of facial recognition technology as an African-American man in Michigan reveals he was falsely arrested thanks to the failed technology.
A detective turns over a picture of a guy inside Shinola, and he's like, "So that's not you?" I look. I said, "No, that's not me." He turns another paper over. He said, "I guess this not you either." I picked that paper up and hold it next to my face. And I said, "This is not me." I was like, "I hope y'all don't think all black people look alike." And then he says, "The computer says it's you."
And Johnson & Johnson has been ordered to pay $2.1 billion to a group of women who developed ovarian cancer after using talcum powder contaminated with asbestos. Johnson & Johnson heavily marketed the powder to African-American women, despite warnings that the products could cause cancer. A number of the plaintiffs in the Johnson & Johnson case died before the trial or after it finished. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Daily U.S. coronavirus cases surged to their highest level since the start of the pandemic for the second straight day Thursday and showed no signs of slowing down, wiping out gains made after hundreds of millions of U.S. residents spent weeks under lockdown. 31 states are now reporting daily increases in COVID-19 cases of 5% or more. The U.S. has confirmed more than 2.4 million cases, the highest number in the world by far. Though on Thursday, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said antibody testing shows the true rate of coronavirus infection is likely 10 times higher. In Arizona, Republican Governor Doug Ducey called Thursday for state residents to wear masks in public, reversing his past opposition to requiring facial coverings.
COVID-19 is widespread in Arizona. It's in all 15 of our counties. It's growing, and it's growing fast across all age groups and demographics.
At the Texas Medical Center in Houston, Texas's largest hospital, 100% of ICU beds are full, and public health officials are worried the virus could soon overwhelm Houston's healthcare system. This is Dr. David Hotez of the Baylor College of Medicine.
I believe if the numbers continue to rise at this pace, Houston is on track to become the worst affected city in the United States.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott has ordered elective surgeries canceled in several counties. On Thursday, he conceded his state is facing a massive outbreak of COVID-19, but said he's pausing and not rolling back the reopening of Texas's economy.
If you do not need to go out and go to work or have to go to the store or engage in some other activity, the best thing that you can do is to just stay at home.
In Florida, a record surge in COVID-19 cases has brought the official death toll to over 3,400. Alabama, Missouri, and Nevada also saw record highs Thursday, while Mississippi's top public health official said he was, quote, terrified we will overwhelm the healthcare system. The coronavirus task force of President Trump and Vice President Pence will meet today for the first time in 2 months. In a major victory for the Trump administration, the Supreme Court ruled Thursday the U.S. government can fast-track deportations of asylum seekers without first allowing them to fight for their case in front of a judge. The 7-2 ruling affects the thousands of asylum seekers whose initial credible fear claims are denied by immigration officers and bare-bone proceedings without a lawyer present. The American Civil Liberties Union responded, quote, today's Supreme Court ruling fails to live up to the Constitution Constitution's bedrock principle that everyone gets their day in court. We'll have more on Thursday's ruling after headlines with Lee Gallant of the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project, who argued the case before the Supreme Court. The Trump administration Thursday asked the Supreme Court to overturn the Affordable Care Act, even as tens of millions of people have lost their jobs and employer-based health insurance coverage amidst the pandemic. Presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden responded during a campaign event in Pennsylvania.
I think it's cruel, it's heartless, it's callous, and it's all because, in my view, he can't abide the thought of letting stand one of President Obama's greatest achievements, the Affordable Care Act.
Biden promised to outline a new proposal on health care in the coming weeks. Throughout the campaign, Biden has opposed Senator Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill. He's instead called for an expansion of the Affordable Care Act and a public health insurance option that would compete with private health plans. More than 9.6 million coronavirus cases have been reported around the world and nearly 500,000 deaths. India is nearing 500,000 cases after reporting its largest 24-hour spike Thursday with over 17,000 new infections. Ukraine also reported a record 1,100 new cases in 24 hours, prompting warnings a lockdown may have to be reimposed. Cases are rising in Africa, topping 330,000 confirmed infections across the continent. Nearly 9,000 people have died of COVID-19 as Egypt and South Africa are among the hardest hit by the pandemic. The World Health Organization's declared an end to an outbreak of Ebola virus in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which killed nearly 2,300 people after it erupted in August of 2018. This is the World Health Organization's regional director for Africa.
It wasn't easy, and at times it seemed like a mission impossible. Ending this Ebola outbreak is a sign of hope for the region and for the world that with solidarity and science, and courage and commitment, even the most challenging epidemics can be controlled.
The U.S. House of Representatives on Thursday approved a Democratic-led police reform bill demanding sweeping changes to laws and policies that have contributed to decades of police misconduct. Its passage came exactly 1 month after George Floyd's killing at the hands of 4 Minneapolis police officers set off a global uprising against police brutality and systemic racism. This is California Democratic Congressmember Karen Bass.
People marching to demand not just change, but transformative change that ends police brutality, that ends racial profiling, and ends the practice of denying Americans the ability to sue when they have been injured, that denies local jurisdictions the power to fire or prosecute offending officers.
A much weaker police reform bill stalled in the Republican-led Senate after Democrats say it didn't go far enough. President Trump has said he would veto the House bill if it reached his desk. Here in New York, a group of activists have camped outside City Hall for a third night in a row. They're vowing to continue the Occupy City Hall encampment until Mayor Bill de Blasio agrees to cut $1 billion from the police department's $6 billion budget. Tatiana Hill is an organizer with Voices of Community Activists in Leaders New York.
We voted for city council. We voted for this mayor. Some of them have made promises to us as communities as far as addressing the needs that we have, and that hasn't happened. We see the harm being done to our communities via the instrument of the police, and we want to end that harm in ways that will increase healing in our communities.
In Wilmington, North Carolina, 3 veteran police officers have been fired for misconduct after accidentally recording themselves talking about killing black residents. One officer said, quote, we are just going to go out and start slaughtering them, using the N-word to describe black people. He went on to say, quote, I can't wait. God, I can't wait. The same officer said he felt society needed a civil war to, quote, wipe them off the effing map. The department learned about the comments after the officers accidentally recorded their own phone conversations in a patrol car. The firings were announced by the city's new police chief, Donnie Williams, the first African-American to ever hold the position. He just took the post this week. Wilmington, North Carolina was the scene of a violent massacre in 1898 when heavily armed white supremacists launched a coup to topple the city's biracial government. They burned down black businesses, including the local African-American newspaper. As many as 300 African-Americans were killed. A former Confederate Army officer who helped lead the coup then took over as Wilmington's new mayor. In other news about the Confederacy, President Trump has personally requested a statue of Confederate General Albert Pike be put back up in Washington, D.C. after protesters toppled it and set it on fire on Juneteenth. NBC's reporting Trump personally called Interior Secretary David Bernhardt to ask the Park Service to restore the statue. Meanwhile, the Army has activated 400 National Guard troops to protect other monuments in Washington. In Madison, Wisconsin, police have launched a hate crime investigation after a black teenager reported being attacked early on Wednesday while she was driving. 18-year-old Althea Bernstein says she was stopped at a red light when 4 white men approached her car. One screamed a racial epithet, and then lighter fluid was sprayed into her car. She told Madison 365, quote, "I turned my head to look and somebody's throwing lighter fluid on me. And then they threw a lighter at me, and my neck caught on fire." Bernstein was able to drive away and was later treated at the hospital for burns to her face and neck. The attack occurred while a Black Lives Matter protest was winding down nearby. In sports news, NASCAR has released a photo of the noose found in the garage of Bubba Wallace at the Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama. Wallace is the only black elite NASCAR driver in the country. Earlier this week, the FBI said the noose was a garage pull-down rope in place since at least October, long before the garage was assigned to Wallace. On Thursday, NASCAR revealed it had examined nearly 1,700 garage stalls at 29 tracks across the country. Steve Phelps, the president of NASCAR, said, quote, "They found only 11 total ropes that had a pull-down rope tied in a knot and just one noose, the one in Bubba Wallace's garage," he said. Earlier this month, NASCAR banned the display of Confederate flags at their races after Bubba Wallace called for them to be removed. In media news, the Los Angeles Times is settling a proposed class action lawsuit brought by 6 black and Latinx journalists, arguing the paper's underrepresentation of people of color in the newsroom is a result of long-standing discriminatory pay practices. On Tuesday, black LA Times journalists called out the newspaper with the hashtag #BlackAtLAT to share their experiences with racism at the paper. The following day, LA Times staff held a near 5-hour forum pushing executive editor Norman Pearlstein and other LA Times leadership to propose sweeping changes at the paper addressing decades of neglect against journalists of color and to foster a more inclusive and equitable newsroom. The Federal Communications Commission is finalizing plans to link the telephone number 988 to the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. It's just the third 3-digit nationwide phone number after 311 and 911. Supporters of the move say it'll direct people in crisis to trained mental health professionals rather than police. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, U.S. suicide rates are highest among veterans, more than 20 of whom die by suicide every day, while LGBTQ youth report they're 3 times more likely than other young people to contemplate suicide. In Louisiana, 2 environmental activists fighting the construction of a major new plastics plant are facing felony charges for, quote, terrorizing an oil and gas lobbyist. Ann Rolfs and Kate McIntosh, who are members of the group Louisiana Bucket Brigade, turned themselves in on Thursday. In December, the activists visited the home of an oil and gas lobbyist and left a box of plastic pellets, bits of plastic pollution found off the coast of Texas. The action came as part of a campaign to halt plans by Formosa Plastics to build a new plant in St. James Parish in an area known as Cancer Alley. Senator Bernie Sanders has proposed a sweeping 10% cut to the military's budget, saying the money could be invested instead in education, health care, and poverty reduction.
If the horrific pandemic we are now experiencing has taught us anything, it is that national security is not just building bombs, missiles, jet fighters, tanks, submarines, nuclear warheads. and other weapons of mass destruction.
Senator Sanders spoke on the floor of the Senate Thursday. On the same day, President Trump visited a shipyard in Wisconsin where he boasted about the administration's, quote, colossal military spending.
We've totally rebuilt the military, $2.5 trillion. And some people would say, well, that's out of the budget. I said, let me tell you something. There is no budget when it comes to our military.
The Pentagon's budget is larger than the next 11 nations combined. And a correction to an earlier headline, the White House Coronavirus Task Force will be holding a public briefing for the first time in 2 months. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a major victory for the Trump administration, the Supreme Court ruled Thursday the U.S. government can fast-track deportations of asylum seekers without first allowing them to fight for their case in front of a judge. The 7-2 ruling affects the thousands of asylum seekers whose initial credible fear claims are denied by immigration officers in bare-bone proceedings without a lawyer present. The American Civil Liberties Union said the Supreme Court's ruling, quote, fails to live up to the Constitution's bedrock principle that everyone gets their day in court. For more, we're joined by Lee Gallant, Deputy Director of the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project, attorney for the Sri Lanka asylum seeker who was at the center of the case before the Supreme Court. We welcome you back, Lee Gallant, to Democracy Now! First, explain his case, and then what you argued before the Supreme Court and the significance of its ruling.
Yeah, so he is, as you said, a Sri Lankan asylum seeker. He is Tamil, an ethnic minority in Sri Lanka, historically persecuted. He was abducted by men, blindfolded, brought in a van, and beaten senseless. He finally escaped Sri Lanka, got to the U.S., and had what's called these fast-track or expedited hearings without an attorney, a very short hearing where he explained his story, and the asylum officer believed him, but said, I'm not still going to grant you asylum because I don't think you're legally entitled to it. And that was notwithstanding him say, and the reason the asylum officer said, I'm not going to grant you asylum is, well, how can I be sure that it was government forces who beat you, and that's what it takes to get asylum? But yet he had told them he thought he was arrested, used the word arrested, which of course implies that it's government officials. He didn't know exactly who beat him, of course, and he doesn't have an attorney and didn't investigate. But the other thing he pointed out is that he was abducted in a van, and every report you look at about Sri Lanka shows this thing called the white van phenomena, where Tamils are abducted in a white van by government officials. So it was a well-known phenomena, and the asylum officer was charged by law with knowing what happens in each country. And once he heard that this man was abducted in a van, he should have understood that was a prima facie case of asylum. Nonetheless, he said, I'm not going to grant you asylum. So we did what most people would do in that situation and try and get a judge, a neutral judge, because the asylum officer ultimately is part of the executive branch, to say, let me review this. The administration said, no, you can't go to a federal court based on a law that was passed, unfortunately, in 1996. We believe the law was unconstitutional, and everyone is supposed to have their day in court by virtue of what's called habeas corpus, which simply means you have your day in court where your liberty is going to be taken away. We prevailed in the Court of Appeals. We went to the Supreme Court, and we argued that the denial of your day in court where your liberty is at stake is unconstitutional. And the framers of the Constitution wanted a judicial check on the executive branch and on Congress where someone's liberty was at stake. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled against us and for the government. As a practical matter, it's a very serious decision and will adversely affect many, many asylum seekers, particularly now. I mean, judicial review is always important, but particularly now where the Trump administration has eviscerated so many of the protections in the asylum hearing itself that it's that much more critical to have a backstop of a federal court.
Lee Gallant, can you talk about the significance of the justices who voted either way? The 7-2 ruling, Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor voted against. Ruth Bader Ginsburg voted with the majority.
Yeah, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg, and Justice Breyer concurred, but on extremely narrow grounds, and said, taking all the specifics of this case, they joined the majority. The majority's opinion was unfortunately broader. I think what remains to be seen is how broadly the Trump administration will try and interpret it. The way we read the opinion, even the majority opinion, is it applies only to people right at the border who have asylum claims. And we'll have to see if the Trump administration tries to expand it. Right now, the Trump administration had already been trying to do fast-track deportations for people living in the country for up to 2 years anywhere in the country, in the interior of the country. I think what we're in for is a fight with the Trump administration about whether this opinion signals it's okay to use fast-track deportations without judicial review in the interior of the country. We believe it does not, and that would raise distinct issues, but I suspect we're in for a fight about that.
And very quickly, this issue of expedited removal was actually not very frequent until the dramatic increase in Central American asylum seekers arriving at the border. So more specifically, how you're fearing it will affect them. And even, of course, though your client was Tamil from Sri Lanka.
Right. And so I think there's going to be a sort of double whammy here, because judicial review was always going to be important for those cases that failed at the initial stage. But I think what we're likely to see are more people failing at the initial stage, because as truncated as the hearings were to begin with, the administration has now for 3.5 years been trying to take away procedural rights even in that initial hearing with the asylum officer, and making it more difficult to get asylum based on things like gender discrimination. And so we're likely to see more people fail their hearings, and now they don't have a backstop in the federal courts. So I think we're likely to see many more people in fast-track deportations removed. But I think even before that, we're fighting another fight, which is that the administration is now using the pretext of COVID to bypass the whole asylum system altogether and deport people within days without any hearing whatsoever. And so we are in the district court in D.C. now fighting that case about whether the government can bypass the whole asylum system. If ultimately they're allowed to bypass the whole asylum system, then all the tinkering in the asylum system will be largely meaningless.
Can you also comment quickly on the ACLU lawsuit that you recently brought against the Trump administration, ordering that against their order that restricts immigration at the border based on the unprecedented invocation of the Public Health Services Act? You filed on behalf of a 16-year-old Honduran boy?
Yes, and so that's the test case, and that's what I meant by bypassing the whole asylum system. The administration now, for the first time in history, is trying to use the public health laws to expel people on the pretext of COVID. Those laws have been in place since 1893. No administration, Democratic or Republican, has ever tried to use the public health laws to expel people. The administration admitted in a hearing on Wednesday that I argued that they thought that public health laws even allowed them to expel U.S. citizens. Fortunately, the judge said that we were likely to prevail on our claim that the public health laws cannot be a parallel deportation system. And if the government wants to deport people, it has to give them the protections, including asylum protections, in the immigration laws. So I think the stakes are enormous in this case, because if that expulsion order stands and the president's reelected, I suspect that he's going to end asylum for the whole second term, based on the pretext that it's too dangerous to allow children and asylum seekers in the country.
And finally, Lee, we often had you on talking about separated children, and I was just wondering if you can give us an update. In the midst of this horrific pandemic, how many children do you still believe are separated from their families in the United States?
So That's a great question. And unfortunately, the government had only given us part of the names in the beginning. They gave us another 1,500 children late, and only because it was exposed by internal government reports. We are unfortunately still looking for the bulk of those children, and we were going door to door in Central America with our partners looking for those children. And now because of COVID, we can't do that. So we still do not know how many children are separated. We have yet to find hundreds of those children, many of them under 5 years old.
And finally, the fate of asylum law in the United States under almost 4 years of President Trump.
I think it hangs in the balance. I think we are really at that turning point where if our legal challenges don't succeed, and the president's elected, there really won't be asylum next term. And I think everyone, the border is sort of out of sight, out of mind. People need to look back on history, think about what happened with their ancestors. A lot of people in this country benefited from the United States' commitment to provide protection after World War II. This would be an unfortunate thing in the United States if all of a sudden we turned our back on the group that needs asylum now, because sooner or later, different groups need asylum. We really cannot end asylum. But that's what's happening if the Trump administration gets its way. Lee Gallant, we want to thank you for being with us, Deputy Director of the ACLU Immigrant Rights Project. Next up, we look at the growing controversy over the police use of facial recognition technology. As a man in Michigan reveals, he was falsely arrested thanks to the flawed technology. Stay with us.
He's taken out his prayer mat and he's searching for a cure, wishing he could take it back to when all was as before. You are the pioneer who had learned to love abroad, who says a small town girl can't do the things she wasn't told.
This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to the growing controversy over police use of facial recognition technology, after the first known case of police wrongfully arresting someone in the United States based on the technology, though critics say there are likely many more cases that remain unknown. It was January 9th when Detroit police wrongfully arrested Robert Williams, an African-American man, in front of his own home based on a false facial recognition hit. His wife and daughters, ages 2 and 5, watched him get arrested. This is Williams and his cousin Robin Taylor describing the ordeal in an ACLU video.
I was completely shocked and stunned to be arrested in broad daylight in front of my daughter, in front of my wife, in front of my neighbors. I can't really put it into words. It was one of the most shocking things I ever had happen to me.
He could have been killed if he would have resisted, being a black man, being arrested, or having any encounter with the police. It could go badly. And, that is something that we worry about in the black family when someone has an encounter with the police.
After Detroit police arrested Robert Williams, they held him overnight in a filthy cell. His fingerprints, a DNA sample, mugshot were put on file. This is Williams describing how the officers interrogated him based on the false facial recognition hit.
So when we get to the interview room, the first thing they had me do was read my rights to myself and then sign off that I read and understand my rights. A detective turns over a picture of a guy inside Shinola, and he's like, "So that's not you?" I look. I said, "No, that's not me." He turns another paper over. He said, "I guess that's not you either." I picked that paper up and hold it next to my face. And I said, "This is not me." I was like, "I hope y'all don't think all black people look alike." And then he says, the computer says it's you.
But the next day, police told Williams, quote, the computer must have gotten it wrong, and he was finally released nearly 30 hours after his arrest. This comes as Democratic Senators Ed Markey and Jeff Merkley introduced a bill Thursday that would ban the use of facial recognition and other biometric surveillance by federal law enforcement agencies. On Wednesday, Boston City Council voted unanimously to ban its use in Boston. Earlier this month, Amazon placed a one-year moratorium on letting police use its facial recognition technology, and IBM's announced it's pulling out of the facial recognition business entirely. Well, our next guest is a computer scientist and coding expert who documents racial bias in this type of technology. Joy Buolamwini is a researcher at the MIT Media Lab, founder of the Algorithmic Justice League. She's also featured in the documentary Coded Bias. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us again, Joy. It was great to interview you first at the Sundance Film Festival. We'll see when that film festival begins again. It's not going to be happening next year. But, Joy, talk about this case. Talk about the Williams case and its significance, how it happened, what's the technology, and what's happening with it now.
Yes, so the thing we must keep in mind about Robert Williams' case is this is not an example of one bad algorithm. Just like instances of police brutality, it is a glimpse of how systemic racism can be embedded into AI systems like those that power facial recognition technologies. It's also a reflection of what study after study after study has been showing. Studies I've conducted at MIT with Dr. Timnit Gebru, Deb Raji, studies from the National Institute for Standards and Technology showing that on 189 algorithms, right, you had a situation where Asian and African American faces were 10 to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than white faces. You have a study, February 2019, looking at skin type, showing that darker-skinned individuals were more likely to be misidentified by these technologies. So it is not a shock that we are seeing what happened to Robert Williams. What we have to keep in mind is this is a known case. And we don't know how many others didn't have a situation where the police or the detective says, oh, the computer must have got it wrong. And this is an important thing to keep in mind. Oftentimes, even if there's evidence in front of you, this man does not look like the picture. There is this reliance on the machine. And when you have a situation of confirmation bias, particularly when Black people are presumed to already be guilty, this only adds to it. Now, the other thing I want to point out is you can be misidentified even if you're not where a crime happened. So in April 2019, you actually had Miss Majid. She was a Brown University senior who was misidentified as a terrorist suspect in the Sri Lanka Eastern bombings. She wasn't in Sri Lanka. In the movie Coded Bias, the filmmaker shows a 14-year-old boy being stopped by police in the UK because of a misidentification. So again, this is not an example of one bad algorithm gone wrong, but it is showing, again, that systemic racism can become systematic when we use automated tools in the context
Joy,
of police.
Let me play a clip from the documentary Coded Bias that shows that story. Police in London stopping a young Black teen based on surveillance.
Tell me what's happening.
This young Black kid in school uniform got stopped as a result of a match. Took him down that street just to one side, very thoroughly searched him. It was all plainclothes officers as well. It was 4 plainclothes officers who stopped him. Fingerprinted him. After about maybe 10, 15 minutes of searching and checking his details and fingerprinting him, they came back and said it's not him. Excuse me. I work for a human rights campaigning organisation. We're campaigning against facial recognition technology. We're campaigning against facial. We're called Big Brother Watch. We're a human rights campaigning organisation. We're campaigning against this technology here today. And you've just been stopped because of that, but they misidentified you. These are our details here. He was a bit shaken. His friends were there. They couldn't believe what had happened to them. You've been misidentified by their systems, and they've stopped you and used that as justification to stop and search you. But this is an innocent young 14-year-old child who's been stopped by the police as a result of facial recognition misidentification.
So that is an excerpt from Coded Bias that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. And I incorrectly said it was canceled, the Sundance Film Festival. I don't think we know that officially for 2021. But Joy, tell us more. He was 14 years old.
Yes, and him being 14 years old is also important because we are seeing more companies pushing to put facial recognition technologies in schools. And we also continuously have studies that show these systems also struggle on youthful faces as well as elderly faces, as well as on race and on gender and so many other factors. But I want to also point out that while we are showing examples of misidentifications, there's the other side. If these technologies are made more accurate, right, it doesn't then say accurate systems cannot be abused. So when you have more accurate systems, it also increases the potential for surveillance being weaponized against communities of color, Black and brown communities, as we've seen in the past. So even if you got this technology to have better performance, it doesn't take away the threat from civil liberties. It doesn't take away the threat from privacy. So the face could very well be the final frontier of privacy, and it can be the key to erasing our civil liberties, right? The ability to go out and protest. You have chilling effects when you know Big Brother is watching. Oftentimes, there is no due process. In this case, because the detective said, oh, the computer must have gotten it wrong, this is why we got to this scenario. But oftentimes, people don't even know these technologies are being used. And it's not just for identifying someone's unique individual. You have a company called HireView that claims to analyze videos of candidates for a job and take verbal and nonverbal cues trained on current top performers. And so here you could be denied economic opportunity, access to a job because of failures of these technologies. So we absolutely have to keep in mind that there are issues and threats when it doesn't work, and there are issues and threats when it does work. And right now, when we're thinking about facial recognition technologies, it's a high-stakes pattern recognition game, which equates it to gambling. We're gambling with people's faces, we're gambling with people's lives, and ultimately we're gambling with democracy.
So talk about the agencies that you understand are using this. I mean, you've mentioned this in your writing: Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, Customs and Border Patrol, CBP, ICE. Explain how they are using them.
Right. And in addition to that, you also have TSA. So right now we have a wild, wild west where vendors can supply government agencies with these technologies. You might have heard of the Clearview AI case, where you scrape 3 billion photos from the internet, and now you're approaching government agencies, intelligence agencies with these technologies. So they can be used to have investigative leads, right? Or they can be used to interrogate people. So it's not a situation where there is transparency about the scope and breadth of its use, which is another situation where we think about due process, we think about consent, and we think about what are the threats of surveillance. So, Joy, you have written, we must fight surveillance to protect Black lives. If you can talk about the calls of the Black Lives Matter movement, people in the streets to defund police departments, to dismantle police departments, how does facial recognition technology fit into this? Absolutely. So when we talk about defunding the police, what we have to keep in mind is when resources are scarce, technology is viewed as the answer to save money, to be more efficient. And what we're seeing are the technologies that can come into play, right, can become highly optimized tools for oppression and suppression. So as we're thinking about how we defund the police, how we shift funds to actually uplift communities, invest in healthcare, invest in economic opportunities, invest in educational opportunities, we have to also understand that as a divestment from surveillance technologies as well.
Talk about the recent announcements by IBM, Amazon, Microsoft, saying they'll pause or end sales of their facial recognition technology. Do you think what they're saying is enough? What exactly are they doing?
So IBM first came out to say that they will no longer sell facial recognition technology, which is the strongest position of all of these companies. It then prompted Microsoft to come out as well as Amazon. And what I want to emphasize is they didn't do this out of the kindness of their hearts, right? It took the cold-blooded murder of George Floyd, protest in the streets, years of organizing by civil liberties and rights organizations, activists, and researchers to get to this point. So it is welcome news that you have household name companies stepping back from facial recognition technologies because it underscores its dangers and its harms. But there are so many other companies that are big players in the space. We have to talk about NEC. We have to talk about Cognitech. We have to talk about Rank One. And so all of this shows that we must think about this as an ecosystem problem. So yes, it's welcome news that we have 3 household tech giants stepping away from it, and it also elevates the conversation, but it cannot end there. And ultimately, we can't rely on businesses to self-regulate or think that businesses are going to put the public interest above the business interest. That is up to our lawmakers. And so this is the moment to step up and enact laws.
So talk about those laws, Joy. You have the Boston City Council, that's where you are. You have the Boston City Council that did they unanimously vote to not allow facial recognition technology? What does that mean? And now you have Congress. You have the Senate just Thursday and introducing a facial recognition bill. And how much does that ban the use of federal law enforcement in using it?
Absolutely. So we did have a unanimous vote in Boston, 13-0, to ban government use of face surveillance technology in the city. I was happy to lend my expertise at a hearing alongside many others calling for a ban, including 7-year-old Angel, who talked about not wanting this kind of technology when she's going to school. And so what you're seeing, not just in Boston, right, second largest state, but across the U.S., coast to coast, we saw the ban in San Francisco. We've seen Berkeley. We've seen Oakland. We've seen Brookline. We've seen Cambridge. We've also seen the state of California say no to facial recognition on body cam. So all of this shows that we have a voice. We have a choice. People are standing up. They're resisting suppressive technology. And also what this shows is even if one city or one state makes a choice, we still have the rest of the American people to consider. So this is why I was extremely happy to see the recent act that was announced this Thursday for the Facial Recognition and Biometric Technology Moratorium Act, because now we can say let's at least provide base level protections for all of the United States. This is the strongest bill that has come out of Congress yet.
And finally, masks. How do they throw a wrench into the works? I mean, people wearing masks now to protect themselves and to protect the community, all except the President of the United States, who doesn't wear the mask. But, you know, how does it affect racial technology? We know that a lot of these protests all over the country have been filmed. Drones have been monitoring them. But what does it mean when people are wearing masks?
It means that the technology becomes even less reliable because to make a match, you want as much facial information as possible. So if I cover any component of my face, that is less information. So you're likely to have more misidentifications. What happened to Robert Williams could become even worse. But it's also normalizing having your face covered, right? And so if more people cover their face or resist these technologies, it'll also be harder to deploy. But masks make it even more likely that you will have misidentifications.
I want to thank you so much, Joy Buluini, for joining us, researcher at the MIT Media Lab, founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, featured in the documentary Coded Bias. To see our extended interview with her, you can go to democracynow.org. When we come back, we look at how Johnson & Johnson's been ordered to pay more than $2 billion to a group of women who developed ovarian cancer after using Johnson & Johnson talcum powder, which is contaminated with asbestos. Johnson & Johnson heavily marketed the powder to African-American women. Stay with us. Dream, baby, dream. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. This week, a federal court ordered Johnson & Johnson to pay more than $2 billion to a group of women who developed ovarian cancer after using talcum powder contaminated with asbestos. In its ruling, the Eastern District Missouri Court of Appeals said Johnson & Johnson, quote, engaged in conduct that was outrageous because of evil motive and reckless indifference, unquote. The appeals court reduced the original verdict amount from 2018, which had been $4.7 billion. But Johnson & Johnson still faces thousands more lawsuits. It recently stopped selling its brand of talcum powder in the United States and Canada, but it continues to sell the products overseas. The lawyer for the plaintiffs told consumers they should throw away any baby powder in their homes. According to internal memos, Johnson & Johnson knew that asbestos may be in its talc products for at least half a century, 50 years. But as concern grew, Johnson & Johnson targeted its ad campaigns at Black, Latinx, and overweight women. In 2007, the year after the International Agency for Research on Cancer determined talc was, quote, possibly carcinogenic, Johnson & Johnson planned to market the product to African Americans in, quote, underdeveloped geographical areas with hot weather and higher AA population, unquote. This is Marvin Salter, the son of Jacqueline Salter Fox, who sued Johnson & Johnson after being diagnosed with late-stage ovarian cancer in 2013. She didn't live to see the trial. Her family was awarded $72 million in 2016, a decision which was later overturned. Marvin Salter testified in 2019 before the House Oversight Committee.
I sincerely believe that Johnson & Johnson took my mother's life. We believed in the company and the product specifically. My mother was a true fan. It was a staple in our house and a necessary part of our hygienic routine. It was as natural for her as her brushing her teeth every single day. She was diagnosed with the late stage of ovarian cancer in April of 2013. It was a rough time for us, but my mother was the type of woman who never let bad news overtake her joy. She was confident she would beat this disease. Her spirit was never broken, despite what was happening to her body. She smiled through it all. Johnson & Johnson has yet to take ownership for what they have done, and they have yet to take one step to make amends to all of us whose lives have been turned upside down because we trusted in this company, and they said their product was safe.
That's Marvin Salter, son of Jacqueline Salter Fox, who sued Johnson & Johnson after being diagnosed with late-stage ovarian cancer. For more, we're joined by Isabel Chowdhury, Senior Policy Manager for the National Women's Health Network. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Isabel. So lay out the significance of this more than $2 billion verdict against Johnson & Johnson.
Thank you for having me, Amy. So this case is really significant. The court found that the plaintiffs proved with convincing clarity that defendants engaged in outrageous conduct because of an, I quote, evil motive or reckless indifference. And so the court ended up reversing some of the jury's award, and ultimately the punitive damages to Johnson & Johnson was $715.9 million, and then also $900 million to its subsidiary, Johnson & Johnson Consumer Companies. So this is very significant for consumers who have been fighting against Johnson & Johnson and alleging that their product caused their ovarian cancer. As well, just last month, in May, the company put out a statement saying that they were going to discontinue selling their baby powder product, their talc-based baby powder product in the U.S., but continue to sell those same products abroad, which will impact countries like Africa and Brazil.
So whole continents, Africa and Brazil. Explain this. And also, I mean, people may be listening, some people, and saying baby powder. So why is it mainly women who are the victims of this?
Well, Johnson & Johnson had engaged, as you mentioned, in practices that specifically targeted women, and they specifically targeted African-American women, Latinx women, overweight women. And we know, and Johnson & Johnson knew and studied cultural norms of certain communities and knew that as part of their self-care practices, certain women use their baby powder products.
For dealing with chafing, also especially in hot countries, dealing with moisture. So if you can explain how the asbestos gets into the baby powder, the talcum powder, that Johnson & Johnson has marketed for so long.
Yes, so the way that talc is mined, it sometimes is commingled with asbestos, and asbestos is a known carcinogen. The American Cancer Society has said so. There is no safe level of asbestos. And so when there's any trace of asbestos in talc, the talc is then dangerous. It can cause cancer. And Johnson & Johnson knew of this for years, going back to the late 1950s. And this is publicly recorded, so we can see through their public documents during litigation that they knew that there were trace amounts of asbestos in those products.
So in 2008, Johnson & Johnson hired an African-American PR firm to develop marketing campaigns for its baby products line. In 2010, launched a radio campaign in the South targeting women, quote, curvy Southern women 18 to 49 skewing African-American.
Yes, so the company contracted with a North Carolina marketing firm called Segmented Marketing Services, Inc., which specialized in promotions to ethnic consumers. And they distributed 100,000 gift bags containing baby powder and other Johnson & Johnson baby products in African American and Hispanic neighborhoods in Chicago. They also launched a 300,000 radio advertising campaign in half a dozen markets, aiming to reach, as you stated, curvy Southern women 18 to 49 of age.
So if you can talk about the women who brought the lawsuit, did any survive it? Did they all die?
Okay, so there were upwards of 20-ish women. I think it was 22 women and their families brought lawsuits against Johnson & Johnson. And as you stated before, they have thousands of lawsuits against them. Through Through this process, families have lost loved ones. Women have died of ovarian cancer. And so this has been a very serious issue that has impacted families, has impacted women, and is going to continue impacting these people if the products are still being sold and marketed, especially abroad. And I understand that their current inventory will still be sold throughout the U.S.
Throughout the U.S., the current inventory before they won't make it again, but they are continuing to make it for other countries. I wanted to ask you about Johnson & Johnson CEO Alex Gorski issuing a statement in support of Black Lives Matter in response to the global uprising after the police killed George Floyd. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. Can you talk about this statement? He said, as the CEO of the world's largest healthcare economy, I must state unequivocally that racism in any form is unacceptable and that Black lives matter. He went on to pledge to focus on inequity in medical care for communities of color. Your response, Isabel?
My response is that the work of equity and justice needs to go beyond mere statements. So Johnson & Johnson joined a chorus of many companies who have pledged to address racism and, stating Black Lives Matter, and especially after the recent events that has led to the uprisings and protests. And so based on their own practices, their historic practices of targeting Black and brown communities, historically marginalized communities, this statement is just not enough. They are a manufacturer that markets and sells products to consumers. These are products that we use on our skin. These are products that impact our health. And so to specifically target and double down on marketing efforts to historically marginalized communities and to continue to engage in those practices and now continue abroad to places like Africa, as I mentioned, they have
Ghana and Kenya in particular, among other places.
Yeah. Ghana, South Africa, Kenya, and also Brazil holds all three segments of its company. And so it's just not enough to put out statements. Their actions need to match the statements, and they have a history of engaging in racist practices.
So what are your demands right now? You're saying that if you go to a store in the United States, you could possibly find this contaminated baby powder. They're saying they're discontinuing it after the current inventory is out. And then in Africa, in Asia, in hot countries in particular, and particularly communities of color.
So my demands are that they outright ban these products globally, especially in places where it will impact the communities that they have targeted in the past. So an outright ban on these products, and also acknowledging that they did engage in these practices and to commit to not continuing to engage in practices that target and harm Black and brown communities.
How many more lawsuits does Johnson & Johnson face?
Well, I know since March, they've had upwards of, I think, 19,000 lawsuits. So they have a lot of lawsuits.
Well, we will continue to cover them. I want to thank you so much, Isabel Chowdhury, for joining us, Senior Policy Manager for the National Women's Health Network. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced by an amazing group of people, sheltering at home as well as here at the studio. It's produced with Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Harla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tamery Astudio, John Hamilton, Rabi Karen, Hani Masood, Adriana Contreras, and Maria Taracena. Our general manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Miriam Barnard, Paul Powell, Mike DiFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, Dennis Moynihan. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe.